Think we're good? All right. I think they just rung the bell. So, how's everyone this evening? It's good to see you. I'm glad the weather's changing. Glad we got some rain. Although I'm not much of a yard guy, I know that are yard people. I love weeds. My yard's full of them. I cultivate them every summer. Sorry, laddie. The weeds in our neighborhood are coming from my yard. So, I try to get the kids out to mow it, and not timely enough. Steve, would you word us a prayer? Get class started.
Let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this day that you've given to us and all the blessings thereof. Lord, we're thankful especially for this time that we can pause the chaos of the week to step aside and gather together. That we can study your word to strengthen our love for you, our knowledge, and our ability to share your love with the world around us. Lord, we pray that we'll be attentive and we can learn all that we can from Jason's lesson. Lord, we thank you for Jason and all the effort that he's put into the study and the presentation of the lesson this quarter. Lord, we ask that you be with each and every one of us. We all have our own various needs and desires. We pray, Lord, that you would be aware of those and that you would have your will be done in our lives, that what's best for us may come to be. Lord, we pray that, again, that you'll be with each and every one of us. Those who couldn't be here tonight, we pray that all of their needs will be attended to as well. Lord, please forgive us of our sins. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. So tonight, we're moving on to Philip. So Philip's an interesting one. We don't have a lot on Philip, but we'll talk through what we do have in the scripture about Philip. But last week, we covered John. Very familiar with John, right? We talked a bit about who he was, obviously, and about how he had to learn to balance certain aspects of his character. And so, for example, he was passionate about the truth, but if he didn't balance his truth with love, that caused a lot of problems, right? And he's very ambitious, and he had to learn how to be humble, and then he finally had to learn what the cost was to follow Christ. He was not the only one. All of the apostles had to learn this same lesson, but those were the life experiences John went through. So this week, we're moving into, for those of you that have been in this class the entire quarter, we kind of broke the apostles into 3 different groups. If you remember, the first set of 4 are the ones that are probably the most intimate with Christ. They're the ones that are talked about the most in the Scripture. They're the ones that are always were the ones that were questioning Christ, always asking most of the questions. We're moving out of that group and we're moving into the next set of 4. And if you recall, they kind of go in order. The groups go in order of those that were the closest to Christ to those that were the least of Christ. And then when you get in that last group of 4 there, we don't hear a lot about them with the exception of Judas that we know about, right? But what's interesting is, like with the first set, who's the first name listed in all of these? It's Philip, right? So there's a good chance that Philip was probably, he was kind of the leader of that next group of 4, we'll say. Right? And we'll see why he might have been, and we'll kind of see what his job was and why that might have been as well. So, like we've been doing, who was Philip? So, we know he came from the town of Bethsaida. It seems like all of the apostles we've talked to come from like 2 towns so far, right? And this is one of the towns he's come from, right? That's the same town that who came from? So that we've talked about. Who else came from Bethsaida? One of the first 4. He's always fiery. Peter, right? And Andrew. Now, the interesting thing about Philip was that name is in Greek, whereas the other ones we've talked about are Jewish. Right? We don't know what Philip's Jewish name was. We know that he's just referred to as Philip, right? Now, why he chose to use his Greek name versus Jewish name, we don't know. Is there significance to that? Maybe. We're going to see in one of the examples we're going to read about here in a little bit, that probably helped him to some degree, because you tend to kind of gravitate to people that you might know or you have some similarity with, right? And there's going to be a group of Greeks that kind of gravitate to him, and this might be why. Maybe he was part of the Hellenistic Jews. We don't know that, but being that he might have adopted the Greek culture more than the non-Hellenistic Jews, that could be a case. We don't know that. Those are just speculations, right? Also, most likely he was a fisherman, but we don't know that either. But why would we make a case for him being a fisherman? Well, if he came from the same town where Philip and Andrew came from, what was the main source of commerce in that town? Fishing, right? So there's a very good chance, even if he was not a fisherman, he knew how to fish, right? In fact, if you guys remember over in John 21, after the resurrection, before Jesus, they see Jesus, Peter says what? He says, I'm going to go fishing, right? And all of the apostles that are with him go with him. And one of them is actually Philip that says, all right, I'm going, right? So at least he knew how to fish. But there's a good chance he was a fisherman. He probably was close friends with Peter and Andrew, James and John, because they came from the same location. These aren't huge metropolises, right? These aren't big places. These are small towns. So they weren't close friends, they would have known each other or known who they were. So there's a good chance they would have known who they were, right? But should that surprise us? Probably not. We can kind of jump to that conjecture. We can't prove it out, but we can jump to that because of where they came from. We only see Philip talked about in the Gospel of John. So there's not like last week when we talked about John, and then a few weeks back when we talked about Peter, we could kind of go all over the place, right? There was a lot to turn to learn about who they were, their personalities, and what they did. We don't have a lot of that with Philip, right? But it's okay. We have enough to kind of figure out who the man was. And then the last bit is we're going to see he's what we consider, especially those that work in business or sales, you understand what a process person is. So when I say someone is a process person, what kind of image or what kind of words come to mind? Detailed, okay. Marilyn? Orderly, okay. Logical, Some might even go another direction and say logistical, right? Concerned more about logistics. We're going to see this is the type of man he is. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just who he is. That may force you down a certain path of thinking when people are so process-oriented and process-driven, right? But this is who Philip was. Someone flip over to 1 John and read John 1:43. So, this is the first time that we've run into so far where Jesus actually is seeking out one of the apostles in the sense of physically seeking out an apostle. right? Because if you remember back in John, or over in John 15:16, Jesus said, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit." So he kind of already had in mind who he was going to pick, right? But from a physical standpoint, this is the first time we see Jesus going and actually telling one of the apostles, "Hey, come follow me." He didn't say that to Peter. He didn't say that to Andrew, right? Now, what's Peter's response? Or Peter, what's Philip's response? Sorry, got my P's mixed up. 45. So Philip runs off, right? He finds Nathanael. He says to him, "We have found him, of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." So we get the impression he's good to go, right? He didn't question. He just kind of got up and followed Christ. Not only did he get up and follow Christ, this reminds us a lot of Andrew, right? Didn't Andrew do something similar? Yep, right? He took off to tell somebody, right? Who does Andrew tell? Peter, right? He runs off to tell Peter. Philip's eager to go. Don't we wish it was that easy when we told someone, "Come follow Christ"? Right? Now, Philip was most likely, if we back up a few verses, if you remember Peter and Andrew, who are they listening to before Christ shows up? John the Baptist, right? So the soil's kind of getting tilled. Like they kind of understand it's time. Christ is showing up on the scene. John the Baptist points out, "Here's Christ," and off they go, right? We can kind of guess that Philip was there as well. It doesn't say that he was there, but it does say the next day. So this is the day after Peter and Andrew, right, have followed Christ. So it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that Philip was also listening to John the Baptist and what was going on, and that he had some inkling of, his soil had been tilled a little bit as well. Now, what's interesting is, for a guy who we're going to see is so geared towards details and process-driven kind of mentality, he still has a seeking heart, right? He still kind of shares that aspect with Andrew, which is a good thing. Right? He runs off, like we just read in 45, he runs off and finds Nathanael, and he wants to tell him, "Hey, I found the Christ. Let's go. Come on." We're going to see a little bit later. This might, after we read a little bit more about Philip, this might be out of character for him a little bit. But I think what it shows is, while he has flaws, we're going to see, he still has a good heart. He still has the desire to want to tell people about Christ. Now, Nathanael we're going to learn, is probably good friends with Philip. Now, the interesting thing we're going to study next week is Nathanael's response is not the greatest, but we'll get to that when we get there next week, because we'll learn about him. But typically isn't the best, I'll call it the best soil to spread Christ's message to those where we have a close relationship, like a friendship, right? We're going to have a hard time taking the message of Christ to someone unless we develop a personal relationship with somebody. Larry talks about this all the time, right? We talked about it when we was talking about Andrew, because that was who Andrew was. He was all about one-on-one individual relationships. That was Philip, right? He wanted to be kind of like Andrew in that regard. What's interesting is, in our next couple examples of Philip, we see Andrew show up in the picture as well, and they kind of seem to be the opposite, right? Andrew's willing to go do something, Philip's not quite as ready to go do something. So anyhow, we need to be ready like Philip when there's those who are seeking Christ, right? This is the same message we talked about with Andrew. Are we ready? Do you have to know this thing inside and out to be ready? You don't, do you? Will we ever know this thing inside out? I mean, you can memorize it all, but still not know it, right? I wish it was that easy to just memorize it and know it inside and out. Mm-hmm. Robert says we're commanded to be able to give an answer. So as long as you know. Yep. Yep. Now we got to be willing, so you can know it, but also hold yourself back, can't you? Let kind of fear get in the way. Not want to go take the message, especially if someone asks. We can let things like the workplace scare us off a little bit. Someone asks in the workplace, I don't know if I want to talk about that here, right? That could get me in trouble. Think of it this way. They asked you. You didn't go ask them. You got to give them an answer. Robert said, got to have an answer, right? So let's turn over to John chapter 6, and we'll read this one. We read this same account from the standpoint of Andrew and his response to Jesus when Jesus was testing them. Now we're going to flip it a little bit, and we're going to look at it from the account of Philip and what Philip does in this same scenario, and we're going to talk a little bit how they're different. So if I can get someone to read all of this, 1 through 14 for me, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. So, we see Philip is apparently kind of put in charge of kind of logistics. Jesus turns to him and says, hey, we got to feed these people. All of these people are showing up. We got to feed them, right? And we're going to see this same thing later on, which gives more credence to the fact that that's his job and that's his role. Which, if we think about it, if you have a group of 12 men and you're traveling around, just like we do with deacons in a church, we got to divide up the work, right? We don't travel around here, but you can't just put all of the work on one person, can you? And so it would make sense that somebody's going to be responsible for logistics. And why not Philip, right? If he is this detail-minded, process-driven, That seems like a perfect fit for him. So, makes sense. So Jesus asks him a question. What's he asking? He says, verse 5, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" And why does he ask him this? Testing him, right? Jesus already knew what he was going to do, but he needed to see what his apostles' response was going to be. So when we talked about Andrew, we talked about the right response, right? Andrew kind of steps back and says, "Oh, here's some bread and here's some fish, and Jesus, you do what you're supposed to do, and you feed these people," right? He had complete faith that Jesus was going to be able to feed them. Philip is the opposite. Philip's thinking physically. He kind of goes off the rails and loses his faith a little bit, and then he's just thinking about, well, this is all the money I got. There's no chance I'm going to feed all these people with this amount of money, right? So Philip starts thinking, well, this is impossible. We call it I called it the master of the impossible, right? But we all have known someone like Philip, right? So when a crowd starts together, let's take this scenario as an example. The crowd starts together. Should be a great occasion. Why? Because all these people want to come and listen to Christ. Except you got this one guy over in the corner, and he's going, okay, there goes 10 more. They're coming in from that side. Here comes 25 from that side. Where are we going to sit them? Got to sit them here. Got to sit them here. Man, I tell you what, it's getting late. 5 o'clock. It's going to run up on supper time. How are we going to feed them? Oh, man, here comes 500 more people in. You know, he's not giving any mind to the glory of the occasion that's going on, right? So this is Philip. That's the kind of picture you need to have in your mind when Philip's sitting here. In fact, I get this picture in my mind when Jesus asks him the question. Philip's roaming around and probably hears Jesus in one ear say something, and he's still counting heads. That's the picture I get. He's still counting heads going, well, how many do I got? And he's like, oh, you asked me a question, Christ? Okay, well, I'll tell you what I have. Whereas Andrew's going, well, what do we have here? We can give to Christ, and he'll take care of it, right? We've all known someone like that, have we not? Now, is there anything wrong with keeping track of that kind of information?
There can be something wrong with it.
There can, right. And why can there be?
Because it can lead you to focus on the wrong thing.
There you go. You completely lose focus on what is the right thing. And that's what happens to Philip, right? He loses focus. He spent too much time focusing on the logistics, and he forgets about the glory of the occasion. Philip's lost focus. Now, we can get down on Philip, but are we all guilty of losing focus from time to time? I am. Any of us who are parents or grandparents that get pushed into driving our kids around, day-to-day work takes us away from Christ, right? Responsible for your spouse. It all can cause us to lose focus. Sure.
I've read this passage a number of times, but you look at it now, it seems to me like Jesus kind of got him off guard, asked him a question that did seem insurmountable, where he thought difficulty. And it seems to me like Philip just stated the obvious. He lets his salary move by this.
Right.
If you're asking where we're going to buy something, that's not really right.
Right.
But was he really obsessing, or was he just making a comment? Wow, there's a lot of people over there.
It could have, right? Dan?
I think Philip was just being normal and checking out the obvious. Hey, we got a lot of people here. Who hired the caterer?
So Dan and Robert make a good point. Philip is could be just simply stating the obvious. That shouldn't surprise you if you know people who are so process driven, right? They will just simply state the obvious and completely lose the vision of what is supposed to be going on. If they get corrected, it's no skin off their nose. They just did the job that they were supposed to be doing.
But if that limits your ability to see the opportunity that's there, we're told to go out and to teach the word, to preach the word to the whole world. And have all been guilty at some point about saying, we can't do that, we don't have the money, we don't have the resources, we don't have the people, there's language barriers, there's all these things, we can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we focus on why we can't do something as opposed to finding out what we can do if you don't know that you can.
Right. Yep. I'm guilty of that, right? To what we've been talking about, life experiences, this was one of those life experiences someone who was so detail focused needed to experience, right? To Ken's point, he needed to be able to be taught, you got to step back and see the whole picture, right? You can't see the impossible. In fact, why would you see the impossible if you've got Christ sitting there and he's probably already seen enough miracles that Christ has done? But his personality tends to lean towards focus on the details, and he got caught up in it again, right? So for someone like Philip, that's just something he's going to have to deal with in those situations more so than someone who's not like Philip, let's say, who's more like Andrew. Yeah.
He may be also someone who's trying to take care of others, like Martha.
That's a good point.
I think it was very similar to Martha, is we need to take care of these people.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. He was trying to take care of them, right? But his focus was mainly the physical part of taking care of them, right? Yep. He got sidetracked and forgot the spiritual piece, didn't he? So the next time we see Philip in the scriptures, we read this one too when we were studying Andrew. If I can get someone to read John 12, 20 through 22, this was when the Greeks came and wanted to meet Christ.
Now among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus.
So we have some Greeks. They're very interested to meet with Philip about Jesus. Why come to Philip first? Any conjectures? What's that? He was Greek, like we talked about earlier. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? He's got a Greek name. Let's go talk to that guy, you know. At the very least, he probably knows, either know his name or he knows where we're coming from, so we can kind of talk the same thing a little bit. Comfort, right? Comfort. Perhaps they maybe knew that he was the guy that was responsible for the logistics and kind of the administrative affairs of the apostles. We don't know, but maybe that's another reason, right? But anyhow, he's asked to arrange a meeting with Christ. Now, Philip appears to be a little unsure what to do. Right? Last time we talked about Andrew, and Andrew kind of being the guy that will take anybody to talk to Christ. We don't get that impression from Philip here, right? But what we've just talked about with all of his focus on details and stuff, before we go getting on to Philip, kind of pawning this work off on Andrew, let's say, maybe Philip misunderstood what Jesus had instructed the apostles to do. Over in Matthew 10, verses 5 and 6, we read, "These 12 Jesus sent out and commanded them, saying, 'Do not go into the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter a city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.'" So what are they instructed? Where are they instructed to go? So the Jews, right? Not the Greeks, Gentiles, right? In fact, Matthew 15:24 says, "But he answered and said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Jesus was sent, this is him talking, to the house of Israel, right? And being the process guy, guys that are so focused on details and process driven, there's no gray area for them, is there? It's either we got a process for that, or we don't, we got to make a process for it. They don't really work too well when it's kind of like, well, maybe it could be this way, or maybe it could be that way. So maybe there was some confusion with Philip. We don't know. But if he was confused about should he actually bring Greek Gentiles to Christ, what's wrong with that logic with what I just read? With what I just read, was there anything in there that Christ said, don't bring people to me? He said, don't go, right? But he never said, don't bring.
Maybe Philip was just thinking, well, Jesus doesn't want to talk to these Greek dudes.
Maybe. Maybe he said that. I don't know, Robert.
You have to consider, though, that all these apostles had learned to recite the entire law and prophets by the age of 15. So for Philip to have met Christ and immediately know he was Messiah makes sense. Those Greeks didn't have letter one of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense that those who would understand what the Messiah is would be Jewish first.
So Robert makes a good point. It would make sense that those who understood who the Messiah was would have been Jewish, because the message would not have been brought to the Greeks or the Gentiles. So they would have probably have come to know Jesus through the word of mouth of people experiencing the miracles that he had done, healing the sick, and all of those kind of things. So they're like, yes, ma'am. Maybe. Could be, right? So they, at least you get the impression they were invited, right? They're not crashing the party. Yep. Yep. Philip's a little bit apprehensive, so what's he do? He doesn't know whether he should bring these men to Christ, so he goes and gets help. Who's he go and get? Go get the guy who's going to take anybody to talk to Christ. I mean, if I'm going to go get anybody, I'm going to get Andrew, right? Because Andrew will do anything. He'll take anybody to talk to Christ. He doesn't care who it is. Philip still has a good heart, right? For kind of the flaws that we're reading in Philip, we still see he has a heart to want to bring people to Christ, right? He's got a lot of things that he trips over himself along the way, but he's got a good heart. We ultimately see an indecisive man who wanted to do the right thing for Christ, is what ends up happening. We get in our own way times, don't we? I can relate to Philip in this regard, right? I think there's times where a lot of us can. Does Jesus talk to the Greeks? He sure does. If we keep reading, what's he do? He basically preaches to them, doesn't he? He didn't have any problems talking to them.
Well, maybe Philip just decided to go ask Andrew just in case, and then if it turned out that was
So you're basically saying he's hedging his bets. If he's going to get in trouble, then it's going to be Andrew's fault, is what you're saying. Oh, okay. Okay. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe. So the last time we see Philip in the scriptures is over in the upper room. So this is John 14, 1 through 11. I think we have time to read through this quickly. If you want to follow along, I'll go ahead and read this. It says, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also, and where I go, you know, and the way you know." Thomas said to him, "Lord, we do not know where you are going, and how can we know the way?" Jesus said to him, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on you know him and have seen him." Philip said to him, "Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us." Jesus said to him, "Have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father in me? The words that I speak to you I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does the work. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father in me, or else believe me for the sake of the works themselves." So this is when Jesus is speaking to his disciples for the last time before his crucifixion, right? But here's the question. Why did Philip ask that question? I mean, think about it. Philip has spent these past years with Christ, studying at Christ's feet, listening to his message, seeing the miracles that he had done, and he still asked this question of Christ. Why did he ask the question?
He wanted visual proof. I want to see him.
Could be. So he's talking about, yeah,
He refers to his Father as a second person in verse 2.
yep,
Perhaps Philip caught on that.
right. So maybe he thinks, I haven't really seen the Father because I'm expecting to see something else. Christ isn't the Father. Right. Right. So you're talking about because he's going somewhere, right? There's something else to go see, right? I mean, Jesus' response, though, gives you this impression like, Philip, what? Why did, I spent all this time with you. Why are you asking me this question? Don't you already know the answer to the question you just asked? Right? It's like when you tell your kids something, you walk out of the room, you come back, and they ask you a question that you just answered. My oldest is like getting that bad now, right? And I'm like, I'm not repeating myself. You're going to have to suffer, right? So why then? Why did Jesus choose Philip? If he spent all this time with Christ and he's still asking this question like he doesn't understand any of the message that Christ brought, why did he pick Philip? All the way up to the night before Jesus is crucified, Philip asked this question. Why would he pick someone like Philip?
He knows what their abilities are. And we sometimes look at all the apostles and say, why did you get it? Don't you understand? It wasn't until the day of Pentecost and the Holy Spirit came upon them that I think they went, oh, I got it. I understand it now.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, we're
Exactly. He knew their potential. In fact, don't we see a lot of examples in the Bible where God knows someone's potential? So I wrote down some examples. Moses, did Moses want the job? He didn't want the job, right? What about Gideon? Where do they find Gideon? He's hiding out when the angel shows up. And he actually addresses him as the mighty man of valor. A guy that's hiding out, really, mighty man of valor. What about Esther? She was scared to death to go talk to the king to save her own people, right? God actually probably has more people in his kingdom like Philip than people like Peter or people like Andrew, because we all have a weakness of some sort that you're just talking about. But God knows our potential, right? One last comment before they kick us out.
It seems like, it's convenient that we have someone like Philip who's willing to ask the question that no one else will ask, because everyone else around will go, well, that was a stupid question.
That's what we love about the apostles. They were always willing to ask, right?
Also, you mentioned several of the apostles, and they're very different people. How many different communities, how many different groups of people can reach because of who they are and how they are?
That's right. Their weaknesses can be covered by one of the other apostles' strengths. But look at who they can make contact with, right? All right, thank you very much for your comments. Time tonight.